This is my tactical gaming monitor. There are many like it, but this one is mine. And I'm also up to something. So this is an OLED monitor. OLED! OLED. I previously did a video on Asus's monitor, which is amazing, 32 inches. And here it is, the F032U2P. There's another version of this one that doesn't have DisplayPort 2.1, but I got this one specifically because it has DisplayPort 2.1, and that OLED display is insanely fast. So you want as an insanely fast interface as you can possibly get. Otherwise, you gotta do kooky things like, oh, it's only 240 hertz when it's 1080p, which is just a bandwidth limitation. Oh, also, I bought this monitor, so yeah. We've taken some sponsorships lately, you might have noticed, just for random stuff, and it's because I had a couple random things like this to buy. So, sorry and/or congratulations and/or please watch the ads. It has Game Assist, low blue light, OSD Sidekick, 6-axis color control. It has a built-in KVM. Yeah, because it's got a USB-C input. You can hook a laptop up to it, or a console and a computer because you got DisplayPort and HDMI, and it makes it easy to switch between the inputs. So it's kind of a KVM, kind of a not a KVM because monitors have multiple inputs. But we've reviewed Gigabyte Aorus monitors in the past, and generally I've been very pleased with them for that functionality. It is an imperfect KVM, but it's pretty good. If you need a perfect KVM, well, I don't have perfect KVMs either, but if you need a pretty good KVM, Level 1 also makes it like a box that does KVM type stuff, but it's always better if the monitor would do it natively, but it needs to do it natively even a little better than it does. So this one versus the Asus one, the packing is better, but perhaps less eco-friendly. Included in the box, you have a mini DisplayPort to DisplayPort cable. This is a DisplayPort 2.1 cable as it is labeled, because DisplayPort 2.1, really ideally full bandwidth DisplayPort 2.1 is actually this micro connector. There are DisplayPort 2.1 connectors that are the full-size DisplayPort, but that's UHBR 13.5, not the full bandwidth of DisplayPort 2.1. A USB Type-C cable, a 5 gigabit A to B cable, USB 3B, HDMI ultra high speed. Now look at this ridiculousness. There's a hologram on the cable. That's because the HDMI consortium, like, you don't even want to know what sort of horrors the HDMI consortium visits upon consumers behind the cloak of darkness. This is really something that should be brought to sunlight, but I'm not going to be the person to do it. This is a 260 watt power brick. Now some of that is power overhead for USB-C charging, which is great, but imagine 200-ish watts burned directly into your retinas from those beautiful light-emitting pixels on this display. That's got to be exciting. Like, I read that, it's like, oh, how can you get excited for a power supply? That wattage is going to go directly into my brain. It's very exciting. Now, the panel itself, for inputs, has dual HDMI, dual DisplayPort, mini DisplayPort, and USB Type-C. The built-in USB hub has 2 Type-A ports on the bottom edge of the monitor, and you have separate 3.5mm headphone and microphone jack. It does also have VESA mounts, so if you would prefer to use a VESA mount without using the stand, you can. It's 100mm. The stand also will let you move the monitor unusually high compared to competing monitors, which is great for tall people. And at its lowest position, you still got plenty of room here. For the controls, it's a 4-way hat switch on the bottom with buttons on either side. And again, you can override what some of the buttons do. And they save a little bit of weight, which is good. The separate power brick, I know it's annoying. The advantage of the separate power brick is that if you're going to use a monitor arm with this, something other than the stand, you can generally get away with less expensive arms because the weight of the monitor is reduced versus with power brick. And remember, 260 watts. I prefer to have power brick built in, but for high-end monitors like this, understanding what goes into it and understanding that this is a 260 watt monitor, I kind of get it. Now, why is OLED so appealing? Because every pixel emits its own light. The problem with it is that because every pixel emits its own light in an uneven way, they'll wear unevenly. The mechanism doesn't always output the same number of photons from now until the end of time. It varies a little bit. The longer it's been on, the less photons it puts out. So the computer in the display has to keep track of that in order to do wear leveling and a whole bunch of other things. And so this is why these kind of display is sort of lagging behind. You know, we've had OLED TVs for a lot longer than computer monitors. And the computer monitors started out wildly expensive. This panel in an LG display just a couple of years ago was over $3,000. So this is quite cheap by comparison. Now don't worry, we're going to do really high-end gaming testing with this, but for now we're going to use the Intel Arc B580 because it has DisplayPort 2.1, well, UHBR 13.5. This actually comes with a cable that is UHBR 20, which is labeled DisplayPort 80. See, DisplayPort has 4 channels, and each channel is 20 gigabit, so 20, 40, 60, 80. That's how they come up with that standard versus 13.5 times 4 is the other DisplayPort standard, because we can't, be consistent about anything with any labeling in the industry because display stuff. But it's cool. It's cool. It comes with the expensive cable, which is good, and it is actually very hard to get that 80 gigabit. Like you basically cannot order that cable from Amazon and have it actually work correctly in all scenarios, which is mind-blowing. Maybe that's going to change soon, that manufacturing is ramping of those kind of DisplayPort cables. The other thing you want to do is hop into the on-screen display, disable eco mode, double check FreeSync Premium Pro is turned on. It should show you in the OSD. There's a lot of OSD options in here for OLED care. You can also make the monitor turn off automatically. This is a default on one of their competitors. The Asus OLED monitors will just turn off while you're gaming or doing anything. And you can disable that if you faff around with the software. It's just like, oh, you've been using this monitor for like 8 hours. Let's just turn it off and try to save it, because it's extending the lifetime of OLED. That is off by default on the Aorus, but it is enableable via the on-screen display. Let's talk for a second about the display finish as well, because the display finish is a little different. It's not matte, it's glossy, but it's not the insanely super reflective like 2007 iMac glossy. It is in between. It is more on the glossy than matte side of the spectrum. So if you have a bright light source behind you, it will be reflected in the display. But for our studio lights, it's not super terrible, but that also means that the tint or whatever finish this is doesn't make the display as black as possible. But that also means that for a given brightness, the display doesn't have to push the pixels quite as hard. You see, you can put a tint over it and then it makes the display super black. But with this, because it's not quite super tinted and you can see through it, like that's a strategy that they did in the design of the display. Because the overlay on the panel itself is not super dark, you can also see how much margin you have at the bezels. And this is because the display will actually move itself a pixel or 2 or 3 to try to mitigate burn-in. You see the Windows Start menu and all the icons, they're basically in the same place all the time. And that can have a burn-in effect, but the processor in the display is trying to compensate for that, because that's really the downside of this panel technology, is that we've got to do all this Herculean stuff to try to make the pixels wear as evenly as possible so that you don't notice, hey, wait a minute, that looks like there's a start menu burned in my display at the bottom. Because all of the other advantages of this display are insane. Like the pixels can turn on and off like 1,000 times a second, which is gonna make it the most amazing picture quality ever. So there you go. This is what Aorus has to offer in the OLED, OLED, whatever you want to call it, light emitting display panel technology. They've obviously been careful to try to avoid letting you create a situation where you can burn in your display and then you would, maybe have a warranty claim depending on when you were able to cause the burn-in, or maybe that's just the wear and tear on the panel. But still, the availability and price point of these displays mean that the previous premium displays, panels that were based on an IPS type technology, which is good for color accuracy, historically hasn't been the highest response time for gaming and other matters. But the technology's also improved. Like, it's not universally true. Like, you could have an IPS panel that has a better response time than an older panel based on another technology like VA. It's kind of wild. Nothing beats OLED in terms of response time, at least not much. It's widely available at this price point and everything else. And the color depth, color accuracy, response time, we've got our OS RTT diagnostics up here on screen. It's a top shelf display. Oh, one other thing you might have noticed in the specifications, this monitor has DisplayPort daisy chain. This is multi-stream technology, MST. That's not Mac compatible. It's a fun technology, but it's more headache than it's worth. Basically, you can run one DisplayPort cable from your computer to the monitor, and then there's a DisplayPort out port on this monitor, which would let you run a secondary monitor. It can work in some scenarios, but there's a lot of scenarios where it will create more headache than it's worth. But if you've got a secondary 1440p or 1080p monitor, you can do that. If you want to run this thing at 4K 240 Hertz, don't mess with DisplayPort daisy chaining. I mean, you can with DisplayStream compression, but again, Macs don't really support DisplayStream compression properly, except for in a couple edge cases where Apple was caught with their pants down and had to support DisplayStream compression because the display stuff wouldn't work at all without display. It's a thing. It's really cool. It's a really cool part of the specification, but it's half-baked a lot of the time. It's fully baked in this monitor. It's really cool. It's just that you might not be able to use it for other reasons, but know that it's there, know that this daisy chain is a thing, and it's really cool, and I'm glad that Aorus tried to support it, because it can be awesome. The input latency on this monitor is very interesting. At 240 Hz, it's basically on the order of 2 milliseconds, but at 60 Hz, it starts at the top of the display with an input latency of about 8 or 9 milliseconds, but by the time you get to the bottom, it's 16 milliseconds. So normally at 60 Hz, it takes 16 milliseconds to display a frame. And so if the latency at the bottom of the display is 16 milliseconds, that's the lowest number that it could be. 16.7 milliseconds, it's perfect. So the display buffers for a little while and then just displays the frame at an absurdly fast rate. And as you approach 240 Hz, this top number gets less and less and less as it goes. The real key differentiator here is that this thing shrugs at running 240 Hz in the full 4K display setup, and at the time that I'm shooting this video costs less than the competing Asus display. It's got more on-screen display features, but the display itself is a little different. It's not truly an apples to apples comparison in terms of the display. There is a matte version that I couldn't get my hands on, I think, and so look for that if you're into a more matte than glossy type display, but even under these studio lights, it does okay in terms of glare and everything else. It's just if you have like sunlight coming in from behind you, you'd probably want one of those extreme matte displays as opposed to this one. But still, you know, that's really not a lot to complain about on this display overall. I love it, it works well. And like I say, the mini DisplayPort can be a little fiddly. You might have to pick up like a Club 3D brand DisplayPort 2.1 cable to be able to use with your desktop, with your higher end gaming setups. But the higher end gaming setups with next generation graphics cards are gonna have to wait, because the Arc is the first GPU to have true DisplayPort 2.1. Well, that's not entirely true. AMD has a full rate, the 7800, the W7800, which I bought one, but it is currently engaged in another project, so I don't have it here where I can, like, you know, do some gaming on that. But there's some new generation GPUs coming from Team Green and Team Red. DisplayPort 2.1, yes. It's exciting, it's really exciting. This display technology is also really exciting. 4K, 32-inch, my personal favorite pixel density right now. Love this. If you have any questions, or if there's anything that I missed, or you want me to visit something with this display, hit me up in the forum. Level 1. I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.